Hello and welcome to another top grade video. One of the easiest ways to get grade 9 with A Christmas Carol is to consider the forgotten ghost. And this of course is the ghostly narrator who tells us early on that I am standing in the spirit at your elbow as you read the novel. It is really going to be worth asking why Dickens bothers putting in a ghostly narrator. You might not have spotted this, but we know that the ghosts are placed there for a reason. The three spirits of Christmas are didactic ghosts. They are teachers. They're there to teach the readers a moral lesson. And then we have Marley and the ghost of the businessman, who are there as a punishment, and they're also desperate now to change their ways from life and to start helping people. But they're powerless, except 7 years after he's dead, Marley gets this one chance to try and change Scrooge. So we have to ask ourselves, what kind of ghost is the narrator? Is he enduring some sort of punishment like Marley, or is he just a teacher like the spirits of Christmas? Well, in this video we're going to explore the many ways that this ghost is actually full of joy, which would suggest that he's a teacher, although there are some aspects of his character which is deeply sexist, possibly even for Dickens' period of time, which suggests that he has some making good to do. Now, just as the other ghosts are there to instruct Scrooge, the narrator is a gentler ghost to instruct the reader. Because by the end of the novel, Dickens wants to have persuaded his readers that they should treat not just the poor differently, but also working people like Bob. And you'll be familiar, I hope, with the argument that most of Dickens' readers of the first publication of A Christmas Carol would have been employers, having serving girls like Fred does in the novel, and would therefore have an intimate knowledge of lots of poor people who worked for them. Now, instead of starting at the beginning with the narrator, I'm going to look at one of his greatest weaknesses, that sexism that I talked about, which you probably noticed every time he describes a woman, especially a younger one. I'm going to read what he says out loud so that you get a sense of the kind of joy, but also lustfulness that the narrator indulges in. This is going to be important because Dickens intended the story to be read out loud. She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised-looking, capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, as no doubt it was, all kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in any little creature's head. Altogether she was what you would have called provoking, you know, but satisfactory too. Oh, perfectly satisfactory. So you get a sense that he is completely inappropriate. Perhaps we get a sense of a ghost who has been cut off from physical pleasures for decades. We don't know how long he's been a ghost. But we can also see a deep sexism in the way he describes Fred's sister-in-law. Let's unpick some of this sexism. First, he goes immediately towards her looks, describing her as pretty. And then he rather insults her intelligence. Calling her face always surprised-looking suggests that there's not much brain power behind the expression. Then he focuses on her mouth, as though she's actually been bred in some way, specifically to please males. She's been designed for kissing. Then we can see this disparaging idea of her being just a little creature, which again suggests that she's been bred for male pleasure. And then, even though she hasn't actually said or done anything, he's decided that her whole being is provoking. In other words, provoking his desires. We can also see how carried away he's getting with the "oh" that he uses so often in the novel. Well, one reason that Dickens creates a narrator is so that he can distance himself from this kind of sexist description while still putting the description in the book. This is a classic case of having your cake and eating it. But there is another sense of Dickens the comedian. He wants us to laugh at the narrator all the way through the novel, which you'll discover in this video. Now, something that you will not have known is that Dickens is playing with the literary knowledge of his audience. So many of the descriptions and events in A Christmas Carol were actually described first 6 years earlier in 1837 in the Pickwick Papers. So characters who would later become Tiny Tim and the Cratchit family, and a misanthropic old man who is given visions by goblins at Christmas, is easily transformed into Scrooge. And Dickens readers would be familiar with all those characters and enjoy seeing how they're tweaked and changed in A Christmas Carol. But he actually goes back a lot further than that, to a famous book published in 1822. This was a childhood favourite of Dickens and would have been a childhood favourite of many of his readers. It's the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, and the scene at which a very lustful suitor pursues a young lady around the room while playing a game of blind man's buff at Christmas is stolen, not quite word for word, but nearly, straight from Washington Irving's book. Now, this isn't the kind of borrowing or theft, if you like, that Dickens could have done without his readers noticing. He does it deliberately so that they will notice it. And another reason for that, of course, is that it comes from the reader's childhood. And we can assume that our ghostly narrator must have died around about that period or before. And so he's expressing the sexism of an earlier time. Now, don't get me wrong, obviously, 1843 was still a patriarchal society and women were still denied many of the rights that men had. But by 1843, we have a massive growth in female writers. Many people are seeing the female intellect as equal to the male in 1843, and there's a huge amount of evidence that Dickens felt the same way, at least in terms of the number of women authors that he published in his magazines. However, there are also interesting details about Dickens' own life which suggest that he was also just as interested in young women as the narrator. So when Dickens was 45, he acted in a play with Ellen Tiernan, who was 18, and who had actually replaced Dickens' own 17-year-old daughter in the part. And a year later, Dickens is 45, and Ellen Tiernan, the young actress, is 19. They became a couple, and Dickens shipped his wife off, who had borne 10 children by this time, to live away from him, and there's even evidence that he tried to get her put into an asylum. So Dickens' attitude to women is complicated, shall we say, but these events are 13 years in the future at the time of writing A Christmas Carol. Now, all that is relevant to the discussion as to how critical we should be of this narrator ghost. Because if the ghost is partly being punished, after all, that seems to be how human ghosts appear in this story, then we must infer what he has done wrong. And if we're thinking about the 7 deadly sins, gluttony and lust are going to be top of the agenda. These literary allusions I've mentioned also help us understand who exactly Dickens was trying to reach. So in the 1840s, 70% of men could read, as opposed to only 55% of women. So we might think a sort of sexist portrayal of women wouldn't have been an issue. However, the price of the novel was 5 shillings. Dickens deliberately set out to price it as a luxury item that only the well-off would buy. Now, the well-off would clearly be educated and literate, and so any women in that household, or indeed young girls, would have been able to read. Anyway, I've chosen it because you can see the drive to educate girls. This is a drive that Dickens shared. Now, it's worth remembering why he calls Bob Bob. Bob was slang for a shilling, and he wants to make really clear to his readers that this book at 5 shillings is a third of the 15 shillings that Bob earns every week. In other words, he's saying to his readers, look, you are flipping well off compared to the normal working man. It's about time you thought about paying them more and also donating to charity. So now we can go back to the sexism of our narrator, and part of the message will be Dickens readers reflecting on how things have improved in society since they were children. The reason that's important is that they could then imagine how society can be changed within the next 15 or 20 years. In other words, Dickens is inviting them to remember that society's rules are not fixed and that they can be changed through collective opinion and collected action. So he wants everyone to be amused at Topper's pursuit of Fred's sister-in-law, but also slightly horrified at the narrator's lustful description, which also belittles the role of women. Now let's look at some things about the narrator I think Dickens wanted us to admire. The narrator isn't just obsessed with young women, but very, very obsessed with food, and in particular adjectives and lists. He loves the idea of plenty, of fertility, of too much. And so in that way, the narrator is a kind of symbol or proxy for Christmas itself, which is all about having too much of the good stuff. Everything Dickens wants us to enjoy about Christmas, from feasting to party games to courtship and romance, are all the narrator's favourites. So we get to this wonderful description of Scrooge as a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Even his meanness and sin are exuberant and extravagant. Marley's chain is also described in a similar way. It's festooned with cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. The effect of these lists is to portray a world overflowing with wonderful detail. And then there is his obsession with food. Check out this list: turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, great joints of meat, sucking pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense twelfth cakes, and seething bowls of punch. So hopefully that gave you a flavour of his lust for life and gluttony, his lust for the plenty of Christmas, which of course Dickens wants us to share. Now this leads us to possibly the most famous description of Scrooge as solitary as an oyster. And I've seen students and teachers get themselves into knots trying to interpret this as a brilliant symbol of Scrooge's loneliness, but I don't think Dickens means it that way at all. So Dickens grew up as a child on the coast of Kent. So here's my picture of Broadstairs in Kent. I went there this half term, and these are oyster shells on the beach. You can see that that's about as far from solitary as you can possibly get. Another clue, of course, is that the oysters in the narrator's description come in barrels. There's nothing solitary about an oyster. No, the reason that Scrooge is described as solitary as an oyster is because the narrator is utterly obsessed with food. We're supposed to laugh at this description. It comes at the end of that great long list of adjectives describing Scrooge, and we're supposed to laugh. It just doesn't fit at all. Another way that it doesn't fit Scrooge, of course, is that oysters were food for the poor. It was cheap, it was plentiful. You'd find oysters being cooked on street corners, just like chestnuts are in the modern day. There's also some brilliant language analysis you can do in his description of the plentiful fruit and vegetables at the grocer's shop. So the onions are ruddy, brown-faced, broad-girthed Spanish onions, shining in the fatness of their growth like Spanish friars. So the very choice of symbolism and imagery here helps us think of the narrator as somebody so obsessed with food that he's like a big fat friar. And that's why he imagines the onions shaped the same way as him. Another really strong clue that that's going on is what else the onions do from the shelves. They're winking from their shelves in wanton slyness at the girls as they went by and glanced demurely at the hung-up mistletoe. So we get this image of the friars, who are actually onions, enticing young women to stop and look at them. And why? Because they've positioned themselves slyly in front of the mistletoe, so the women who are stopping are ready to be kissed. Now, this is obviously an absurd image. We can't imagine the onions jumping up and down and kissing the women who want to buy them. It's a fantastically comic image personifying the onions, but also giving them the personality of the narrator. This is where his two lusts and passion come together. And the other layer of humour here is that Dickens could have chosen any round vegetable or fruit to compare to the flirtatious friar desperate for a kiss, but instead he chose the one vegetable you wouldn't want to kiss: onions. Which is another way Dickens wants us to laugh at his narrator as well as mostly with him. The narrator's obsession with food also allows him to be really hyperbolic, that means to over-exaggerate, in his description of the food and Tiny Tim. So we can't really believe that the turkey was twice the size of Tiny Tim, and if Dickens were the narrator himself, he would partly lose his audience. But as this is obviously part of the foodie obsession of our narrator, we go along with it. Dickens then uses the narrator to have a little joke with the audience again. So this is the narrator's description of the turkey. He could never have stood upon his legs, that bird. Now, there was no battery farming in Dickens' day, so obviously the only way that this turkey got about was standing on its own legs. So this again is totally hyperbolic, and the audience would enjoy that, but recognise it as an exaggeration. He would have snapped them short off in a minute, like sticks of sealing wax. Now, the sealing wax is also another interesting simile. Much like the oyster, which came as a surprise, so does the sealing wax. Sealing wax was used to seal important documents. You'd melt the wax and then you'd have a stamp that you'd push into the wax to leave your insignia or mark. This is actually a copy of Dickens' own sealing wax with an example of his handwriting. So the point of the sealing wax reference here is that it comes right towards the end of the novel, where Dickens is looking forward to closing up the manuscript, putting the sealing wax on it to say it's finished, and taking it to his publishers. It's a kind of convoluted joke right at the end of the book where Dickens is saying to his readers, look, you're just coming to the end of the book and enjoying reading it, but here am I writing it, and I'm coming to the end, and I'm so excited because I'm going to publish it in about a week's time. Many of you will know that it only took him 4 weeks to write A Christmas Carol, and it was a rush job. He needed to get it out just before Christmas because that's when his market was. Another way that the narrator's obsession with food helps is when he describes the food at the Cratchits dinner table. They have an equal obsession with food for the opposite reason to the narrator. They never have enough food. This is why we get this wonderful description of the pudding singing in the copper. What this literally means is that the pudding is being steamed, and the sound of the steam, like the sound of steam from a kettle, actually makes a noise. This noise is likened to singing because it's celebrating that this massive dessert is coming. It also gives us a real insight into how rare it is for them to have any kind of dessert, so that the Cratchit children make an expedition within their own house to go and see the pudding. That's how extraordinary it is to eat well. So contrasting the narrator's love of food with the Cratchits' lack of food is a great way to ask the reader to compare themselves to the narrator. They're much more like him than they are like the Cratchits. Knowing this helps us interpret that beginning, where the narrator says, "Mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail." This digression is extraordinary in such a short novel, and it introduces us to a narrator who just loves his own eccentricities. And again, this is a kind of Dickens joke. We would expect this kind of rambling digression in a much longer novel, and so we think we're going to get lots of digressions, but actually we don't. The story moves on at a real pace. But knowing that we're being guided by an eccentric narrator, helps Dickens increase that level of comedy so that we laugh with him at his descriptions, but also at him where his descriptions reveal that really eccentric personality. I think this also gives the narrator the persona of a sort of drunk relative we might have round at Christmas, the uncle who is always hilarious but also embarrassing. And the other thing that the narrator allows Dickens to do is tailor his stories to the way his audience would have experienced it. It's worth considering how a middle class and an upper middle class audience would have read such a book at Christmas time. Well, one thing that's unlikely is that they would each take it in turns to read the whole book, spending 2, 3, 4 days or a week each and then passing it on. No, a Dickens book was a major event, but reading was also a major event. And the family would have read it out loud to each other. Now we can see that the narrator's eccentricities are also to produce different voices that the novel would be read in. The mother or the father, or perhaps an older sister or brother, would have read it out to the family as a performance. Which also explains why the narrator is so addicted to lists, and especially interested in the descriptions of food. There is another structural feature of having this narrator's style in the book. Instead of Dickens having to explain the story to us, the narrator actually cheats and has Scrooge tell us what the action is. So at the end of the novel, Scrooge himself actually tells us how much he's changed. He ends up speaking to himself in a way that is completely unrealistic, but it fits because it's being told to us by this eccentric narrator. And look at how he ends this in Stave 5. Never mind, I don't care, I'd rather be a baby. Hello! Whoop! Hello here! Well, he's just talking to himself. This is totally unrealistic dialogue, which nevertheless is written, as you just heard me painfully try to do, to perform. I mean, when was the last time you yourself used the word whoop? It's actually something that my son does in my house. He goes whoop, whoop, and then whoever's within earshot has to yell out, "It's the sound of the police! Whoop, whoop!" But that wasn't really a thing in Dickens' day. But by coincidence, that was also the theme song to Attack the Block. A fantastic film, and it's the only film I know that my sister has been in where she didn't have to play somebody Spanish. She was still foreign though. See if you can find who she was. Now, by the way, that was a digression. See what I did there, being the narrator? Hopefully that made the video a little bit more entertaining for you, in the same way that the narrator is supposed to make the story of Scrooge even more entertaining. And now let's consider the very last line of the novel, where the narrator withdraws himself and replaces himself by giving the last word to Tiny Tim. God bless us, everyone. This invites us to imagine that we have all learned the same lesson that Scrooge has learned, not just to be generous in charity, but also to the poor. When Tiny Tim says everyone at the end of the novel, he's not just talking about his own family. The narrator is using it to mean everyone on earth. We all have a responsibility to look after them. And in particular, those rich readers who will be employing so many domestic servants of their own, and probably paying them even less than Scrooge pays Bob Cratchit. Feel free to click on one of the videos. That will really help with your revision of A Christmas Carol. Or if you're feeling lazy, go and watch my sister in Attack the Block. See you soon on my channel.